Hello, Byzantine history students. This is the promised supplementary lecture on Leo the Isaurian and generally the stuff of chapter 8 in Gregory's work. I want to make a couple of announcements of things that are coming up here. On Wednesday, I'm going to take some time to talk through some pictures with you when we're back in class together. These pictures will be the actual icons, and there I'll be going through the iconoclastic controversy as a separate set of slides. That the controversy, as you know from your reading, stretches from chapter 8 through chapter 9. And on that issue, Gregory needs a great deal of correction. He simply does not understand the intricacies of what's going on with the iconoclastic controversy. On Wednesday, then, after a good look at icons, or perhaps in with and under a good look at icons, we will be finishing chapter 9, and I'll hand out, if I can stay on top of things with my midnight to 3 in the morning schedule of working on this course. I'll also hand out the test guide Wednesday, if at all possible. The test will not cover chapters 10 and 11. That was way too ambitious on my part when I wrote that into the syllabus. So the test, which will be on the 14th, will cover exactly through chapter 9 in Gregory, plus whatever material I've presented since the last test. It will not be comprehensive. It'll be just on the material between test 1 and the date marked test 2. So through chapter 9, no more. We'll talk about that more on Wednesday. As I promised last time, what I'd prefer to do with class time and with supplementary lectures, because Gregory does such a detailed job of running down the general history, I don't find it necessary in this middle period of Byzantium to repeat what he said with greater detail as I did with some of the earlier lectures. What I do want, however, is to address some things he misses. He does a fine job, for instance, in chapter 7, demonstrating the turmoil of the later 7th and early 8th centuries, the period just prior to Leo the Isaurian, and so I'll let his work stand there. But one thing that must be noted is that, like most writers of Byzantine history textbooks, he focuses on the rulers and the elites as far as these are recorded in the official records, not just the rulers and the elites, but their actions. So that's what most standard line Byzantine histories do, and Gregory's no exception. I think it's a good thing, as I mentioned on the first day of class, because it allows us to follow the big names as kind of a pathway through Byzantine history. But this habit of focusing on the top can be quite misleading if we wish to understand Byzantine society and culture as a whole. Most of the population, after all, was not part of the ruling 5,000ths of the percent. I don't know if that's accurate or not, but it's a tiny, tiny group of people in an empire of many, many millions that winds up being the focus of the standard off-the-shelf Byzantine history. My fire's getting a little crazy back there, popping away. Got too much balsam on, not enough birch. You'll be hearing it from time to time, I'm sure. In the 8th century, I maintain, the confusion over elite versus popular perspective among historians has led, and by that I mean modern historians, not Byzantine historians, they knew who they were, but modern historians' assumption that somehow focusing on the elites can give us the story of an entire people. This creates serious problems of interpretation, particularly relating to the Empress, or as she styled herself, the Emperor, Irene, and the iconoclastic controversy. In this online lecture, I want to present a little different interpretation than that of Gregory in regard to the basic political developments, and that'll be a few slides tonight. In class on Wednesday, I will present a very different interpretation of the iconoclastic controversy, based upon the commonly neglected divide between the ruling elites and the culture of the masses. In short, here's the trailer, or the preview of what's coming Wednesday. The iconoclastic position, the position that wants to destroy or abandon the use of icons, is the position of a smaller ruling elite. The position that favors the use of icons is definitely the position of the majority population in the Byzantine Empire. More on that on Wednesday and a little bit later in this lecture. Leo III, called the Isaurian, Gregory points out that he's actually a Syrian. His mom and dad are from Syria, but were relocated to Thrace. How he got the name the Isaurian is hard to say. Gregory simply suggests it's a misnomer. It may also be that his own actions in Isauria or the fact that many of his followers were from the province of Isauria in Asia Minor could have led to the name. In any case, the name has stuck, and we'll continue calling him that because he's the father of an entire dynasty, which we call the Isaurian dynasty. It goes up through the Emperor Irene. In 717, if you recall from chapter 7, you have basically one military coup after another, usually led by some shadowy mafia figures involved with the syndicates, the Blues or the Greens, or some other mafia-like group in the empire. Leo actually comes to power as the result of another military coup, but this time it's all military. The military is fed up with the corruption in the capital, and they are no longer interested in following emperors who are changed more rapidly than the senators change their laundry. I won't say socks because they didn't really wear them. And this leads to the coup that brings Leo to power. Gregory's right in saying that Leo inherited chaos, but he also inherited something more. He inherited the rivalry of the internal syndicates, which had played the power game during the recent turnovers of emperors, and he had to address these kind of mafia-like rival powers in the empire. Leo was a very, very good general and knew it well. If you're looking for a historical analogy, somebody like Eisenhower or Vespasian comes to mind. They begin life as generals and take that insight with them all the way to the top. Of course, Eisenhower wasn't truly an emperor, now was he? He was president of the United States. Vespasian was emperor, and I'm voting for him on Tuesday. The best way to view Leo, I think, and this is something you don't get in Gregory and you don't get in your general Byzantine history course, but you do hear it talked about a great deal among, well, the scholars that talk about Byzantine history. In other words, the conference I went to at Villanova, this interpretation of Leo was pretty standard. It just doesn't make it into the textbooks yet. He was a reformer. He wanted to reform. He wanted to change the empire, bring it back to some moral ground, and reunite the empire under a single emperor. The model you have in Eusebius of Caesarea describing this action of Constantine, uniting the empire, bringing everybody together under a single autocratic emperor, who of course is obedient to the single Christian God. This image, I believe, is in the minds of everyone who regards themselves as a reforming emperor in the Byzantine world. And this would certainly apply to Leo. I think he was quite the student of that lovely text I forced you to read, The Life of Constantine by Eusebius of Caesarea. And that's the pattern he's following. He wants to bring the empire back to that ideal. It means reforms in several areas. The first is the military, what he knew best, and he did it well. The army had become fed up with failure. In Leo, they had a leader who could redress past losses, which he did, beginning with the second major Arab siege of Constantinople. Gregory has a great description of it in the book. It doesn't last long, and it leads to a series of victories throughout Leo's reign, which effectively drives the caliphate, the Umayyad Caliphate it still is, back through Asia Minor and out of the Asian portion of the Byzantine Empire. The battle lines drawn again at Syria, the Syria-Palestine area, and Asia Minor is a Byzantine province. The revolts of the theme commanders, which Gregory describes. Now, reminder, just because one is a popular and powerful emperor doesn't mean that one doesn't have enemies in the army. In fact, it may mean you have more, because others think, hey, well done, I could do it better though. Let's try military coup after military coup. Well, Leo has no interest in seeing himself removed. And unlike previous emperors who are the puppets of one faction or another, Leo takes matters into his own hands. He puts down the revolts of the rival generals in the various themes, and replaces them with men who agreed with his direction and policies. He also took the opportunity to divide the themes up into much smaller areas, so there are many more smaller themes. What this means is that no one general of any theme is going to gain enough power just from his own territory to really threaten the position of Leo. It was a smart move. Many smaller commanders of smaller areas are not likely to unite under one banner against the emperor as just one or two small or one or two larger strategy generals of the larger themes. After all, he doesn't want to have happen to him what he and one close colleague did to Anastasius in the previous reign. The other thing that he needed to reform, and this was long overdue, we talk rather optimistically about the Codex of Theodosius II, we talk rather praisingly of Justinian's law code, but neither of those codes was as original as particularly Western historians like to make it. Leo did something very different with his Ekloga. His law book, Gregory describes very well. It virtually abolishes capital punishment while leaving really some pretty nasty, hideous corporal punishments, like the all-time favorite, cutting off the nose, in place. The idea was that to kill a person is to wage war on God, because human beings are made in the image of God, so death has been taken far too lightly in the old Roman Empire. A mutilating sentence, as much as that may make us cringe or wince or really not particularly like the people who put it forward, is a very different approach to law. You may physically scar somebody, you may physically disfigure somebody, but you leave them alive to enjoy what they can of life afterward. And the cutting off of the nose was an interesting phenomenon. Before you think of it as particularly Byzantine, I want to inform you that this type of stuff was done throughout English history, all the way through your favorite kings and queens, the Tudors and the Stuarts. I have one fellow that I wrote a book chapter on, a fellow by the name of William Prynne in Stuart, England, who had his ears cut off twice as a way of marking for the public that the guy was seditious and an opponent of the crown. I don't know how you get your ears cut off twice. Presumably the first executioner, the first fellow who carried out the sentence, left enough ear left over for executioner number 2 to work with in William Prynne's case. I just want to point out that the habit of Western audiences to look eastward and say, oh my God, those Byzantines were incredibly cruel, usually is done at the expense of an honest look at Western history. Since medieval and early modern English history is another field of my expertise, I can assure you the English people who tend to be particularly judgmental of Byzantines have nothing to talk about, as I'd mentioned when I introduced the Byzantine history course. So the value of a punishment that maims is that anyone can see you coming. If you're missing a nose, you're quite distinctive. Or if you're missing a pair of ears in later Tudor history, you've got, when you take your hat off, or if your hat doesn't fall down over your eyes, people know there's something wrong with you. So also with the nose. And for offenses against the family, particularly adultery, which is what Gregory writes about, the idea that you have no business putting yourself back on the meat market with a perfectly marketable face gives some at least reasonable justification, if it's still sick, wrong, and socially inappropriate, for this particular crime, this particular punishment of cutting off the nose. Other things were done as well, and the slitting of the nose was a punishment for other crimes also. By the way, the English also cut off noses, lest you think they restricted themselves to ears. And I also want to put another piece of perspective in here. All the way into the 19th century, corporal punishment, maiming, and branding were typical of the British penal system. Up through the 1820s or so, you had offenses that would be punished with a maiming or a branding. When the habit of long-term imprisonment replaced maiming and branding, it was a fascinating result. The criminals staged as much of protest as incarcerated criminals could do. They would far prefer to be, branded with a hot iron on their forehead so that everybody could see by the initials RT that the person branded was a rogue thief. They much preferred that to long-term incarceration in a prison for a matter of years. The sense of, gee, at least I retain my freedom was very strong among the criminals themselves who were punished. So, strange perspectives from the past, but because we don't think this way today, we look at it and think of it as cruel, wrong, and horrible. Fair enough, but everything has to be kept in perspective. The real significance of the ekloga, which doesn't come across properly in Gregory, is that it may be the first attempt ever to bring the legal code of the empire in line with Christian ethics. This bit about not destroying the image of God, not killing, except in the last resort of punishment. And later, after Vladimir of Kiev, the Russian Viking dude who converts, we'll hear about him in due course, I believe. When he converts to Christianity, he abolishes the death penalty altogether. So this is an interesting twist that you see throughout the East. The maiming remains, but the old codes and judgments of the pre-Christian empire, including the codes of Theodosius and Justinian, many of which were not enforced because they ran counter to the morality of the increasingly large Christian population, these codes prescribed death by hideous, hideous ways. One of my most favorite ones to talk about is drinking hot lead. In theory, that was not even considered a death penalty, but after drinking hot lead, those who had done it seldom had a different result. They usually expired slowly, painfully, and with plenty of time to think about what they'd done. So it's another interesting twist in the history of the Christian East that we now have a law code that at least is trying to reflect a Christian ethic by reducing the death penalty and making the penalties less destructive on the people involved. Not Theodosius, I've got Theodosius on my mind. Leo also reformed society, and here I just want to note that the factions and syndicates, these mafia-like power brokers, they now faced an emperor who had no interest in acknowledging their power. Previous emperors throughout the 7th century, the chapter 7 stuff, this Dark Age that Gregory talks about, were usually puppets of the syndicates in one way or another, or had to side with the syndicates in order to build their own power base. Leo came to power with a significantly large army behind him and had no interest in compromising with the Blues, the Greens, or any other quasi-governmental group in the Balkan Peninsula. This needed reform of society, the purging of society of these syndicates, was also perhaps a reason for an updated, easy to follow for local judges, very clear legal code which would be enforced, as opposed to the previous legal codes which really had been ignored by and large throughout the 7th century. And then finally, he sees the need to reform religion. This maybe wasn't one of his better ideas, but he did it because he believed in what he was doing. Leo's stance against icons was both sincere and a means of ensuring that Byzantine religion was united in one interpretation and perspective, namely his interpretation and perspective. It wasn't just icons, really, that he was concerned with. He wanted religious decisions and religious practice to follow what he considered ideal, whether or not society would go along with it. This also served to clarify his position within the Byzantine world. He stood for something, and others who would agree with him would have to stand for it as well. In other words, like Constantine becoming Christian in the first place, Leo is calling the bluff of anyone who might claim to agree with him and yet secretly harbor a stance against the emperor. In Leo's case, though, it was, I believe, unquestionably sincere. Gregory makes that point also. He truly believed that icons should not be used in Christian worship. What I want you to take from this more than anything, and Gregory should have made a much more precise point here, the society in which Leo comes to power is incredibly fragmented, in which the rulers, the so-called emperors, whether they functioned as anything more than that in name is debatable, the rulers had become very dissociated from the people. This is another issue that Gregory doesn't consider. The ruling elites are facing a group of people who have learned to use any means at hand to survive the strange civil wars and the strange civil unrest that you have in the empire, and from a purely utilitarian stance, religious identity and local religious rulers, in many cases, came to replace the unity supplied in past ages by the emperor and the empire. The Isaurians were effective. In most cases, Leo's position worked quite well. He also had the good sense to secure the succession by crowning his son co-emperor and following through with appropriate propaganda. In your textbook, you have a nifty picture that was actually put out by Constantine V, Leo's son, this coin, that has Leo on one side, recognizing the unity of the empire, and then Constantine V and his own son, Leo IV, on the reverse side of the coin. The propaganda is saying it's all one empire, it's all one family. You can trust us just like you trusted Leo. Whether that would plug into an actual sentiment in the population of trust for Leo is debatable, but you can see what's going on here. Like Constantine I, unifying the empire through propaganda and political choices, so also Leo and Constantine V have the same agenda. They don't need more division. Constantine V continued the policies of Leo with great success. He was also a good military leader. He had this brief period of time where it looked like the empire would fall completely out of his hands. The revolt of Artavasdos, that's a great name for my next dog, we'll call him Artie for short. Artavasdos, his brother-in-law, tried to secure the throne. Didn't last very long against Constantine V. Leo and Constantine together had done a good job of unifying the powers within the empire, eliminating the rival powers such as the syndicates, and Constantine V was firmly on the throne after about a year and a half of some confusion. He had tremendous success against the Arabs at this point also. There's kind of a power vacuum in the Umayyad and very shortly the Abbasid caliphates. Part of that power vacuum in 750 leads to the fall of the Umayyad Caliphate and the rise of the Abbasid Caliphate. But he also worked well in the north, fighting another barbarian tribe, the Bulgars. What I'm going to have to do on Wednesday, I think, is give you kind of a cheat sheet of who all these different peoples are. The Slavs, the Avars, the Khazars, the Bulgars, so you know really what's going on the borders. As you might expect, there's an awful lot of bleed over with these people, and they all tend to hang out in the area that we now think of as Bulgaria and Romania, around the Danube. Well, in one particular battle at Anchialos, the Bulgars are absolutely destroyed by Constantine V. He inherited his dad's ruthlessness and ability as a general. There was one issue that Leo and Constantine had really set up to cause problems for themselves, and that was the issue that built from Leo's condemnation of icons onward. Public sentiment against their policy of destroying and banning religious icons intensified under Constantine V, in part because Constantine was far more rigorous and systematic in his opposition to icons. In other words, his hardline approach, don't do this, I'm the emperor, don't mess with me, man, it causes a backlash, and there's something of a grassroots rebellion against the policy of iconoclasm. This is not a singular event in history by any means. You can think about, after the Bolshevik Revolution, the Soviets try to restrain religion. Later on, they get much harsher, and by the years of Stalin, you have an absolute war on religious figures, shuffling them off to the gulags if they survived that long. In the Soviet case, this was a sign that the policy itself was failing. People were not giving up their religious convictions, legal or illegal though they may be, and so also the policies of Leo in regard to icons, much as he believed in them himself, went against the majority population of the empire by this time. Boy, there's a lot to say on that, but Gregory generally gets it wrong in suggesting that even early Christians did not have representative art in their worship. I'll show you pictures that demonstrate quite otherwise. Actual archaeology flies in the face of Gregory's claim here. So what Leo is doing is pushing forward a policy of the minority, much as the Soviets did. The majority of Russia was Christian and remained so. Leo pushed a minority policy against the majority. His son followed up, became much more rigorous and hardline than Dad was, and the backlash intensified to the point where by Constantine V's death, he was going to face trouble. He had the good grace to die before the trouble came about, but there he was. This caused him certainly not to be well remembered. As you read in Gregory, he gets the name Kopronimos, which sounds okay in English, but in its literal translation from Greek, it means poop name. All right, that makes a lousy literal translation. It sounds about like about a first or second grade insult. Hey, poop name. Yeah, all right, whatever. In Greek, it's a little more sophisticated. The name goes back to a scandalous and probably true story that when he was baptized as a baby, he was dipped in the font and he pooped right there, plop, plop, into the baptismal font. This is embarrassing, to say the least, for Mom and Dad, but it also has an interesting series of religious and cultural significances which don't come across in Gregory's text. When a child is baptized, the entire font, by virtue of the prayers that the faithful say over the water, becomes holy water, and water that over which the Spirit has moved. It's supposed to be pure. It's by virtue of the prayers and the ritual, a more perfect form of water than you're going to find anywhere else in the natural world. And for a kid, signifying what he would do as when he was an adult, or so historians such as Theophanes, who didn't like him much, will claim, he pooped in the holy water. Now, the word itself, kapronimos, when a child is baptized, they receive their Christian name. This habit of christening also occurs in the medieval West. You get your Christian name, your official name, during your baptism when the child of God Konstantinos is baptized in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, you get your name from that point, from the point of your immersion in the water of baptism. Well, since the immersion in the water of baptism led to pooping, his name is crap. His name is shit from that point on. And while I don't think his followers and friends called him this much, the habit of his increasingly large number of enemies, most of whom were his enemies precisely because of his religious stance, no other reason, shows kind of the direction that society was going. This, again, is something that Gregory doesn't bring out correctly. He doesn't get that the majority of Christians by far were opposed to the policy of iconoclasm, even if they may have sympathized moderately with the idea that perhaps there were abuses in the church that needed to be curtailed. If they were sincere in their iconoclasm, we must note that the stance of Leo and Constantine on icons also had a political aspect to it which worked to their advantage. Pardon me. Oh, man. I had to burp. Both of them knew that the Byzantine forces were spread far too thin, and trying to maintain little bitty footholds all over Italy and trying to protect, say, the papacy in Rome from the Exarchate of Ravenna was virtually impossible to maintain, especially with wave after wave of Lombards rushing up against Ravenna. And in 751, when the Lombards finally take Ravenna, the attention of the empire could legitimately be turned to maintaining more defensible holdings in the south of Italy, around Naples and Sicily particularly, which remained Byzantine for hundreds of years to follow, while leaving Ravenna to the Lombards and leaving the papacy, who is now the enemy of the Byzantine emperor because the emperor has rejected icons, leaving the papacy to rather fend for itself or to try to make alliances, which is what they do, with the northern Franks, who had converted from Arian to Orthodox or Catholic Christianity. And so the change in power is occurring right there. But from the point of view of Leo and Constantine, it means you aren't spread so thin trying to defend an indefensible Ravenna. Unfortunately for the Isaurian dynasty, Leo IV, the son of Constantine V, was both a weaker individual as an emperor than his predecessors, Leo III and Constantine V, and far less of a general. He died in battle against the Bulgars in the year 780, after only 5 years of reign, leaving his 28-year-old wife and his 9-year-old son in control of the empire. Irene. Wow. Don't even know that I'll be able to talk about a fraction of the things that I've looked into in her reign. She was an amazing figure in Byzantine history. Following on a long tradition of powerful empresses, going back to Pulcheria and the ladies of Theodosius I's household, Irene was the first to choose the title, which might have been perfectly honest for somebody like Pulcheria as well. She chose the title of emperor, signifying to everybody who wanted to know that she had no interest in co-ruling with her son or merely ruling until he came of age. She regarded herself as the ruler of the empire. And indeed she was. For all of her son's minority years, and even after he came to adulthood, she really was the great power of the realm. She did not come from a high-standing household, and this, I think, explains a lot about her decisions and a lot about her popularity among the masses, not necessarily the ruling elites, but among the masses of the Byzantine Empire. She was an orphan, and she was passionately in favor and a firm believer in the iconophile, the pro-icon faction of the empire. In English language histories, and I don't even know quite how to categorize all the biases involved in the treatment of Irene. Misogynist would be a place to start. English language histories begin with Edward Gibbon, who, like most 18th century men, had an inadequate view of women, to say the least. But in writing of her, she's just treated like garbage. She was evil, she was incompetent, she was all the weaknesses ascribed to women by any misogynist ever. Irene is guilty of them. She's both powerful and incompetent. She's a slave to her own emotions, and this causes her to do irrational things. It's only very recently that Western historians are starting to take a new look at Irene. And I think the previous look, when you compare Eastern histories, say histories written in Russia or Greece, describing Empress Irene, the whole anti-Irene stance. She may not have been the perfect emperor, but she certainly was an amazing lady. The anti-Irene stance says a great deal more about Western biases and Western bigotries, I believe, than anything about Irene. Her willingness and ability to engage in games of power, and the cruel way in which she most likely, we aren't sure she was entirely behind it, but probably, the cruel way she dealt with her own son, Constantine VI, leads most authors to hold her to a standard they never apply to the rest of the Isaurians. I'm not sure that sentence is properly constructed. I was typing fast, but pretend it is. Most authors, in other words, assume that she should somehow have been less cruel than Constantine V, less cruel than Leo III, less cruel than her own husband Leo IV. All of them were cruel in their own way, and she, if anything, was probably less cruel, but since she behaved like them, she's treated badly. She's called calculating. Well, what emperor isn't calculating? If we apply the same rules to boys and girls in this little club, I think Irene is going to look pretty much like yet another emperor in the Isaurian dynasty, or throughout Byzantine history for that matter. What frustrates me quite a bit is that there are tremendous comparisons to be made between Irene and another lady I lecture on in my other field of expertise, or one of my other fields of expertise in British history. Queen Elizabeth I was cruel, vindictive when necessary, extremely calculating in everything she did, and she certainly slaughtered, by her own decree, something in the neighborhood of 800 Catholic priests as a way of eliminating political competition, and she did so in a far more cruel way than anyone Irene ever dealt with. If you want to know what happened to a Catholic priest in Elizabeth's reign who may have supported a cause other than Elizabeth's monarchy, drawing and quartering is the rule. It's what happens to Braveheart at the end of that movie that is otherwise completely ahistorical. So look it up. I'd personally rather be swiftly dealt with by Irene than wind up being on Elizabeth's blacklist. I say this to bring up the point. We tend to look favorably on Queen Elizabeth I. She patronized the theatre, she saw to the glories of England, she ensured the safety of the realm against the Spanish Armada, she sponsored Francis Drake, that pirate bastard as he's known in Spain to this day, on his voyage around the world. I don't see a whole lot of difference in the choice of actions between Queen Elizabeth, whom we praise, and Irene, who is condemned by the same British authors. Gregory has gone a long way in his textbook, and I'm very much appreciative of this, toward rescuing the image of Irene. But one of the things that even Gregory misses, even though he treats her much more fairly than most authors, is the way she sided with the most popular religious figures of the day, dissident iconophiles. Now, all of the Isaurians to this point have been iconoclasts. They want to destroy icons. They want the veneration of icons to cease in the churches. She takes the opposite side and does so quite consciously. The dissident iconophiles, people like Theodore the Studite and their followers, are the ones that Irene will support during her years as emperor. She also meant it. She grew up with this popular view of religion, this very strong favoring of religious art, both for its aesthetics and for its value in worship. But she benefited from the support of the masses. What supporting the iconophile clause, or the iconodual cause, does for her is separate her from all the other Assyrians. Now, she's got a son who's going to make a play for the throne, and he's going to get the throne for a brief period. But Irene has the vast majority of people in the empire on her side because she chose the popular horse rather than the elite horse of iconoclasm. She also meant it. One of the things that cannot be denied about any of the Assyrians, the iconoclasts were firm in their belief that they were doing the right thing. Irene, for her part, was absolutely firm in her belief that restoration of images and the use of images in worship was the right thing. Nevertheless, it's politically convenient as well. Perhaps if she had been less sincere and compromised or allowed her enemies to have some leeway, she would have been remembered as more successful by Western historians who have the weird habit of praising cruelty in men while they condemn it in women. Nevertheless, she did what she did, and she was successful up to a point, and that point is not properly appreciated by the armchair emperors that most Western historians are. A few key dates. 787 is the Second Council of Nicaea, where icons are declared to be good and appropriate for worship. More on that on Wednesday. In 790, the army, which has a significant number of iconoclasts still in its officers' ranks, even though she replaced many of the generals with people who agreed with her. Now you think, and this even is interesting in Gregory, this is talked about as weakening the army. Well, it's pretty much what Leo III did when he came to power. He replaced people who didn't think like him with people who thought like him. It may even be less than correct, given the military successes her generals have, to say, as Gregory does, that they were inexperienced. They may not have been generals for long, but they apparently knew what they were doing in warfare well enough to ensure that as long as there was money, there would be success against the barbarians and the Arabs both. In 792, after Constantine is restored to the throne, Constantine VI is put on the throne, really, not restored. He was always technically emperor, but nobody listened to him. Constantine realizes that without Mom, he's nothing. He has to recall Irene and rule jointly, or face a rebellion on many fronts, including the non-iconoclast faction in the army. Constantine was probably put back there to be a puppet, and there were far too many factions that supported and agreed with Irene. She was popular, he was not. This shows the wisdom of her backing the popular faction of the iconoduals, or the iconophiles. There's no way, after you have the tremendous support of the masses of the empire, that somebody who's got a minority position is going to be supported wholesale in his bid for the throne. To wrap up the political side of things, it's tough holding myself back on all I want to say about the iconoclastic controversy, but we need to wrap up the political side first so we can clear the field to talk about nifty pictures on Wednesday. In 795, Constantine VI did something really stupid. He divorced his wife and remarried a girl of his choice. Now, emperors had mistresses before, and here too is a parallel with Byzantine history and English history. Everyone was willing to look the other way when Charles II, in the 17th century, had a whole stable full of mistresses, as long as he remained married to the one woman who he claimed to be faithful to. This probably would have worked for Constantine VI had he not made a public showing of it. Morality in the Byzantine Empire had blossomed in a direction of a very strict interpretation of the Christian scriptures and Christian understanding of divorce. When he openly flaunts the direction that the entire public, including the iconoclast faction of the public, believes is correct, believes is honorable, he's just done something really stupid at so many levels. It is a sign of exactly what had happened with the general population of the empire during the dark and violent 7th century that he became instantly and permanently the target of derision. An emperor like Constantine I could set aside his wife, marry another. An emperor like Constantine VI was facing an empire that believed that this was a really nasty sin. This was a form of adultery. Their piety had grown because the chaos, I believe, of the 7th century had pushed them that direction. During the dark years, religious piety had grown. This was, according to Christian teaching, clearly adultery. To set aside your wife and marry some hottie that catches your eye. Note the punishments listed in Leo III's Ecloga. The punishments for adultery included punishments for a man who would set aside his wife because she no longer pleased him. This is not acceptable. Marriage is to be for not just life in the Byzantine understanding, the Greek understanding of the, Greek scriptures. Marriage is for eternity. You have one wife. If for some reason that marriage is wrong, God makes concessions, God sorts things out, but you better have a very good reason for divorcing her, like, oh, she tried to murder me in my sleep last night. She isn't pretty enough, doesn't do. She's getting old and kind of plump, doesn't do. Marriage is supposed to be a permanent state. Even as Christ is permanently married to one church, he just doesn't set aside his chosen people for any other. So also a husband is to be true to one wife. This is the mindset that Constantine has completely insulted, both among the iconodules, his enemies in the iconoclastic controversy, and even among his supporters, because they didn't think it was right either. So, really, really dumb move. There were calls for his nose to be cut off, not surprisingly, since that's the law for adultery, as Leo III set it forth. The emperor should be held to the same standard, was the argument. The power of the church had grown, in other words, and somebody like Constantine I, way back when, in Eusebius of Caesarea's day, could be kind of a Christian in name only, when nobody's going to particularly raise a fuss. When Constantine VI pulls it, he's facing an empire that believes that the description of divorce in the Gospel of Matthew is far more important than what the emperor's personal wishes might be. He must be pious, and this is one of the developments, the increase in piety in the 7th century, that is going to mark the next century and more of Byzantine history. 797, 2 years later, the emperor is entirely unpopular. We don't know for sure if it was on Irene's orders. Could be likely. I don't want to suggest that she didn't do it. We can go overboard in trying to rescue Irene's image, I'm afraid. Constantine VI was blinded by her supporters, or perhaps it maybe wasn't on her orders, but with her sanction, because they were particularly vicious in the way they blinded him, not something a mom would do to her son. This probably caused his death. They cornered him. They, instead of using the more traditional and safer and healthier way of blinding somebody, using a really sharp knife, making it swift, as painless as possible, allowing the eye to heal, the rumor has it, and the rumor's likely correct, that they used a white-hot iron applied to each of the eyes. Now what this does, I'm sorry, I can't help my 6th grade sense of fascination with with pain and body fluids is going to take over here for a minute. The thing that led me to teach history of medicine in the first place. When you slit the eye, it can heal, and the person's going to be blind or certainly unable to see properly after that because they have a mutilated eye. When you burn out the eye, think about what happens when you have a burn on your skin that's particularly bad. Hot grease falls on it. If you've ever had a particularly bad burn, the pain is there constantly. It doesn't go away. Certainly it leaves scarring. The scars hurt almost as much as the initial pain of the burn. So this constant burning, instead of being, say, on your arm if you had an accident frying French fries at McDonald's or something, or on your exterior skin. Not long ago, I had an accident in the laboratory. We'll just leave it at that. And no, I'm not doing anything illegal, just questionably intelligent. But I wound up with some nasty burns on the side of my face. Man, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Just hurt. If these burns are inside your head, they're in your eye socket, that burning's not going away, the pain's not going away ever. And this is what happened to Constantine VI. Eventually, those wounds suppurate. They start to fester because there's no way, barring effective antibiotics, which didn't exist until the 19th century, there's no way, not really effective ones didn't exist until the 20th century, there's no way to stop the continued festering of those wounds. And so his eyes are going to just be running with pus and the effects of suppuration. And yeah, that would cause his death. That's a pretty nasty thing. Some people survive the process. They were never quite sane afterward. He didn't. Okay, I'm done with that. But I thought, hey, since people, if I don't talk about such things, somebody's thinking, well, how did they blind him and why'd that cause his death? Well, now you know. Had Irene not been devoted to the cause of the iconophiles, the cause which kept her in power internally, by the way, because she kept the masses of the people on her side, she might have been able to balance her religious policy with a military and social strategy to keep her realm solvent and hold off the powerful armies of Harun al-Rashid, the next major caliph of Dar al-Islam, the House of Islam. I think such speculation, though it goes around among historians, well, she put way too much energy into the iconoclast controversy. All right, well, fine. I think it ignores one thing. Nobody's stopping Harun al-Rashid until he starts losing momentum. The reality is the Islamic world was on the upswing in a way that no Byzantine army would be capable of handling in and of itself. The other reality is Irene had balanced far too many different things, including being a female emperor ruling alone, and the sheer number of opponents that she had developed among the ruling classes was going to lead to problems. Among the problems she has to face, in 800 there is now a second emperor crowned, and this is Charlemagne, the barbarian Frank, who is crowned emperor by Pope Leo III in the year 800 Christmas Day. So he's now, the title is Holy Roman Emperor, not of the West, but just Holy Roman Emperor. And there's questions, as Gregory points out, who gets to be emperor, Irene or Charlemagne? Far too often, again, misogynistic, bigoted historians will look at Irene and say, see, she should have done something about Charlemagne. This was set up when, as a result of Leo's policy, Constantine V withdraws from Ravenna, letting the Lombards have it. The popes got no choice. They were both emperors, Leo III and Constantine V, were enemies of the pope because they took a stance religiously which the pope could not support, the stance of iconoclasm. So the idea of Irene somehow being responsible for the Western world finding its own emperor is kind of silly. That's a result of her predecessors' choices. And I want to make that clear. A habit of blaming her for everything is just kind of silly. In the next 2 years, however, Irene does another very Elizabethan thing, and she plays around with the idea, how serious I don't know, but she plays around with the idea of actually marrying Charlemagne. It's his idea. He suggests that this would be a great way to cement an alliance between West and East. I suspect, like Elizabeth, again in England, she was never particularly serious about it, but it was one way of keeping everybody, including her own court, off guard so that she could continue to function. Again, Elizabeth did the same thing. Very few historians condemn Elizabeth for stringing along her suitors, but for some reason, Gregory's a little better this way, but an awful lot of Byzantine historians are going to say, see, she had totally lost it by the end of her reign. She was even contemplating marrying Charlemagne. Yeah, whatever. She sure didn't do it, and she didn't seem terribly excited about it. How serious the whole thing was is debatable. But in pretending that, just like Elizabeth in pretending that she was serious about the King of Spain, the King of France, the Duke of this, the Duke of that, in pretending she kept people guessing. And it's not a bad strategy for a lady very much in a man's world, as Irene was. In 802, and here we're going to wind up for the evening, in light of a plot against her rule, which she knew about full well, and the plot was partly as a result of her consideration of the marriage proposal of Charlemagne, Irene decided the power games were over, and she retired to a monastery that she had founded some years earlier, where she lived out the remainder of her days. What to make of Irene? It's hard to call her ineffective after taking a serious look at the 7th century and the chaos that preceded the Isaurians. Nevertheless, by the end of her reign, she had a situation where there was a potential civil war developing again. The realm economically was not in good shape, and as far as the iconoclastic controversy goes, she had chosen the popular side. She had chosen the side that probably inevitably would win. But in choosing that side, she had made a significant number of enemies among the ruling elites, and those ruling elites would ensure that the pendulum would swing the other way. Again, I want to complete this talk with another brief comparison to Elizabeth. Elizabeth is often remembered for wonderful things, all the movies made about her, the kinky stuff with the Essex affair, the beheading of Mary, Queen of Scots, the powerful woman who stood her ground with the entire Spanish Armada bearing down on England. But for as much as she's considered successful, those who study history of England with me know that when she died, she left the realm in political chaos. She left the realm afraid that there might be a civil war if there were any objection to James of Scotland suddenly taking the throne of England. Ooh, whoa, think of that. The Scots, they used to kill us all the time. We used to kill them all the time. Now he's going to be king of both kingdoms. There could be chaos there. And economically, brilliant as Elizabeth was in so many ways, economically the realm was in a shambles that almost guaranteed the civil war of the 17th century. If we're going to see Elizabeth in a positive light, we have to say Irene is certainly no worse than Elizabeth. If we're going to see Irene in a negative light, we're going to have to be a little more honest about the way we look at some of our heroes in history and be fair with our assessments. So on Wednesday, it's going to be picture time. I want to walk you through what an icon actually is. That doesn't come across well in Gregory. I want to walk you through the actual history of Christian art, which is dead wrong in Gregory, and introduce you to exactly what the iconoclastic controversy meant and why thousands and millions of people would be willing to suffer and be persecuted rather than give up their practice of venerating icons in the course of their worship. We'll also then go through chapter 9, and review for the test. So I'll talk to you then. Good evening, or in my case, good morning.